Did the Marvel Cinematic Universe really die after Avengers Endgame?
That is an excellent question.
Since Avengers Endgame was released in 2019, Marvel Studios has released 13 movies, 17 seasons worth of MCU shows, and 2 specials. But I keep hearing people saying that they either stopped watching after Endgame or think the franchise fell off a cliff since that film. First, let me address those people who say they stopped watching after the Infinity Saga. So does that mean you haven't seen Spider-Man No Way Home, Deadpool and Wolverine, or Guardians of the Galaxy Volleyball 3? What are you punishing yourself for? Immediately after Avengers Endgame, we got Spider-Man Far From Home, a movie with 91% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, 95% from audiences, and a rating of 7.4 on IMDb. On top of that, Spider-Man Far From Home was the first Spider-Man movie to make over $1 billion at the worldwide box office. So, objectively speaking, the MCU didn't go downhill straight after Avengers Endgame.
WandaVision!
Marvel Studios then produced their first ever show to be set in the MCU, WandaVision. One of the criticisms that's often labelled to superhero movies and shows is that they're all the same, following the exact same formula each time. And while I disagree with that statement, WandaVision is a piece of content where that argument just cannot be applied. It is something fresh, having every episode be filmed in a style that reflected different eras of television. This also helped it feel like a show rather than a movie stretched over half a dozen episodes like most of the other MCU series. Marvel even kind of reminded us that they had the X-Men and Fantastic Four back, with Evan Peters reprising his role as Quicksilver. But not really. This is an objective video, so even though I absolutely loved WandaVision, my opinion doesn't really mean much, except it does actually mean something here, because the Rotten Tomatoes scores were 92% critics, 88% audiences, and 7.9 on IMDb, which makes sense why it was the most watched show airing at the time. So once again, the MCU remains strong post-Endgame. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier followed WandaVision, which was a series that allowed people to really appreciate the Marvel Cinematic Universe expanding to shows on Disney+, because it meant more of their characters could evolve, like Sam Wilson and the very Marvel-named Bucky Barnes. And not just the title characters, they also organically brought back Baron Zemo, Sharon Carter, Badrock the Leaper, the Wakandans Dora Milaje, plus new significant characters like John Walker, Joaquin Torres, Isaiah Bradley, and Eli Bradley. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier showed us that Marvel was really willing to spend money on these series. While WandaVision had a big CGI battle, it wasn't until the final episode, which made me concerned that each of these series would save their money until the finale. However, that was definitely not the case, having numerous CGI heavy moments, including the cinematic quality opening aerial chase. But did this all stack up review-wise? Well, this was the lowest piece of MCU content since Endgame, scoring a terrible 85% from critics, 81% audience, and 7.1 on IMDb. So is this the start of the end for the MCU? No, because next was the first season of Loki. The show got 92% from critics, 90% from audiences on Rotten Tomatoes, and 7.9 on IMDb. And you can see why, because they were able to do something rare by taking an iconic character who had limited screen time and successfully made him the lead. Prior to this show, Tom Hiddleston had never had more than 21 minutes of screen time in any of the 6 MCU movies he featured in. Sometimes it doesn't take much to stand out. Darth Vader, for example, only averaged 11 minutes and 20 seconds in each of the 3 original Star Wars films, and he's arguably the most iconic on-screen villain of all time. Sometimes more is not necessarily the answer. People might like something because it's the exact right amount, so it was risky for Marvel to interpret the enjoyment of a character as giving us more of them. But as the reviews tell you, they pulled it off. They also once again showed us they were willing to do things differently. Prior to the first season of Loki, every superhero movie and show ends with a big boom boom explosion bang car chase. But for Loki, they went, what if we just have 3 characters sit in a room and chat? While some people just watch superhero movies for the big action scenes, having an 8.6 out of 10 rating for the season 1 finale shows that there are plenty of fans who enjoy slower, well-written dialogue episodes too. Black Widow was a movie that Kevin Feige wanted to make for a very long time, going all the way back to 2014 when one was in serious consideration. However, according to Collider, the likely reason for there being no movement until the early 2020s was because Ike Perlmutter was CEO of Marvel Entertainment and someone Feige had to report to directly. In 2015, that changed, allowing Feige to report directly to Disney after his alleged frustration towards Perlmutter, who is known for being a bigoted person. I claimed that no one wanted to watch female-led superhero movies, using the flops of Elektra and Catwoman as examples. You know, 2 movies that have a combined Rotten Tomatoes score of 19%. Again, combined score. Ike also told toy companies to scale back on producing female merch because he believed girl superhero products wouldn't sell. So having that kind of person around making decisions meant it was tough for a Black Widow movie to be made, leading to more time and focus being put onto already greenlit films, leaving no room for Black Widow to easily fit amongst the slate of movies in the Infinity Saga. And when the character was killed in Endgame, it limited the story that could be told for her solo film. Marvel didn't want to make it an origin because we already knew so much about this character from other people's movies, so the decision was made to set it after the events of Captain America Civil War. While it ended up being reviewed positively, with 79% from critics, 91% from audiences on Rotten Tomatoes, and 6.6 on IMDb, I think if it had come out after Civil War, it probably would have been looked back on more positively. But again, still not poorly reviewed. And it also wouldn't have suffered from the impact of COVID, only making $380 million at the worldwide box office, with The Incredible Hulk and Captain America the First Avenger the only 2 films at the time to have made less.
What if?
Luckily for What If, it was a TV show, so people could watch it from home during the pandemic. Marvel once again tried something new, giving us their first animation series set in their ever-expanding MCU, even having most of the cast return to voice their character. The first episode made me concerned that we were just going to get, what if instead of this character, it was this character? But rather, we got some really interesting ideas that wouldn't have been explored if it wasn't for this series. Being an anthology series, it's a lot easier to look at episodes individually because we get a contained story as opposed to a single part of a larger narrative. Having said this, there were many highly rated episodes and an overall rating of 7.7 on IMDb. And it was just as well reviewed on Rotten Tomatoes, with critics scoring at 89% and audiences saying 92%. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings was Marvel Studios' first movie or show with an Asian director and Asian lead, but second movie to be affected by COVID. While it did better than Black Widow, who had her film released in the peak of the virus, it's disappointing the movie didn't get to reach its full box office potential, particularly after Rotten Tomatoes scored at 92% from critics, 98% from audiences, and 7.3 on IMDb. One of the things I've always loved about Marvel is thinking about long-term success rather than short-term. If Marvel Studios was run by almost anyone else, we'd only be getting Iron Man, Avengers, and X-Men movies, because those are films that are proven to be financially successful. But you have to remember, the first Iron Man movie made $585 million. It was not only a risk to make due to the lack of knowledge towards the character, but it was only the 8th highest grossing movie of that year. Both The Dark Knight and Hancock beat it at the box office. So by taking risks with movies like Shang-Chi, or Guardians of the Galaxy, or Black Panther, and other lesser known characters, it gives them the potential to become an Iron Man. No one asked for those movies, yet they made them, and the reviews will tell you that we loved them. Another movie no one asked for was Eternals. Unfortunately, this was an example of a film that didn't work out for them in more ways than one. I still stand by the comment that movies should take risks, expanding on the universe and giving us fresh characters, but Eternals was not only another COVID-affected movie, but the first Marvel Studios project to receive a rotten review, specifically from critics who gave it 47%. However, audiences seem to enjoy it more, with a respectable 77% and 6.3 on IMDb. After reading a lot of the reviews from all different ratings, I noticed something you don't often see, and that was a lot of people giving it a 7 or 8 out of 10. The reason why I bring this up is because when people seem to like something, they say 10 out of 10, and when they don't like something, it's 1 out of 10. I didn't see many perfect scores, and I think it's because people were giving more honest and analytical responses to their perception. Now, you may love or hate this film, but I just found it interesting that not many people were trying to defend their positive opinion, which made me believe that a lot of people who enjoyed Eternals generally fit outside the Marvel fandom, because as we know, fandoms love to tell people they're wrong when someone has a different opinion. Eternals felt like a movie trying to broaden their audience, reach new viewers. 13 years had passed since the start of the MCU, so a turnover of fans wouldn't be a surprise. So it makes sense that it would have a different feel and vibe about it, even being directed by Chloe Zhao, who had just won an Oscar. Now this is the 8th piece of MCU content since Avengers Endgame, and the only one to have underwhelming reviews. Prior to this, all the other content was not just fresh, but certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. So I feel like this objectively debunks the general idea of the statement that the MCU died after Avengers Endgame. But let's continue to see if Eternals was the real start of the end. Seeing as though every other OG Avenger got their own solo movie, it was only fair that Clint Barton shared a TV show with another Hawkeye. Going straight into the reviews, the series was seen very positively. Critics gave it 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, audiences said 88%, and 7.5 on IMDb. So at this stage, it just looks like Eternals was just a slight hiccup. Interestingly, this was the first MCU show where all the episodes weren't directed by the same person, unlike WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki, and the first season of What If. It was also the first piece of Marvel Studios content to confirm that those Netflix series officially exist within the same universe. I know there are people who will say that they were always canon, but nothing produced by Marvel Studios ever referenced movies or shows produced by Marvel Entertainment. Marvel Entertainment were the only ones who ever referenced Marvel Studios movies. Marvel Television, under Marvel Entertainment, included things like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Inhumans, and Daredevil. Until Hawkeye, Marvel Studios had never mentioned that Phil Coulson was still alive, that there were Inhumans on the moon, or corruption in Hell's Kitchen. So unless this is a situation where it's the same actor in a different universe, like J.K. Simmons playing the very Marvel-named J. Jonah, Jimmy, Jason, Jackson, Jordan, Jasmine, Jordan, Josephine, Jessica Jameson, Jr., the show at least confirmed that the Netflix series are now canon within the MCU.
That's a magic number.
Speaking of Daredevil, he appeared in Spider-Man No Way Home, a movie that had an Endgame feel about it. Audiences were well and truly back, with the latest Spider-Man movie making nearly $2 billion worldwide to become the 7th highest grossing movie ever. And if you were in a cinema like mine at a midnight screening, you would have experienced excitement very few movies can provide. It's these types of movies that I love to see in a theatre, because they provide an experience you can't get anywhere else. Not only do a lot of people now have a big TV with great picture and sound, but they're more willing to wait a couple of months to watch a movie from the comfort of their own home for less cost. But one thing homes can't provide is an audience of hundreds of people cheering when Andrew Garfield removes his mask after stepping out of the portal. It's an incredibly rare experience, but they're the movie-going moments I remember. So even if you didn't enjoy Spider-Man No Way Home, but you saw it opening weekend, you'd still have that memory of someone yelling, "Pizza time!" when Tobey Maguire emerged from his portal. Having said that, according to Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb, not many people dislike Spider-Man No Way Home, scoring 93% from critics, 97% from audiences, and 8.2 on IMDb, making it the highest rated project produced by Marvel Studios since Avengers Endgame. So after 10 MCU movies and shows since said film, the average critic score on Rotten Tomatoes is 85%, audiences is nearly 90%, and the IMDb average is 7.4. Those are pretty high numbers. Back on TV was Moon Knight, released in 2022. With there not being much of a break between each Marvel project, this series was a nice standalone show. You don't have to have seen literally any MCU movie or show to understand Moon Knight, unlike most other projects. I hear this argument that you don't really need to have seen certain movies to understand current ones, but that always comes from people who have seen everything. Those more part-time viewers miss out on a lot of references and story points and character development that ultimately make a movie or show more engaging. Moon Knight also didn't expand into the wider MCU, so even this series isn't essential viewing. So I think that was refreshing for those casual viewers. That was always my biggest fear with the MCU expanding to TV. The more content you put out, the harder it is to keep up, and the further you fall behind, the easier it is to drop off. And if enough people drop off and it stops making money, the franchise dies. Luckily, it didn't die after Moon Knight, getting great viewership, scoring 86% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, 88% from audiences, and 7.3 on IMDb. I believe Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is the most underrated MCU movie, and it didn't even score badly. In fact, it was 74% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, audiences gave it 85%, and on IMDb it was 6.9. But personally, I love this movie. However, I think I know one of the reasons why it was reviewed as good instead of great. In the trailers, Patrick Stewart as Professor X, Captain Carter, and other members of the Illuminati were revealed to be in the movie. So people thought if those characters had been spoiled in the trailer, surely there must be way more surprises in the film. But there wasn't really. Therefore, expectations were extremely high, and if you can't meet or exceed expectations, you ultimately leave underwhelmed and disappointed, even if it was a good movie. For this reason, I tend to find that the second viewing of movies is almost more enjoyable than the first, because I know exactly what's going to happen and I can appreciate it for what it is, rather than what I want it to be. However, that first viewing is also unique. You only get to see a movie for the first time once, which is why I don't watch trailers and try to avoid knowing anything about a movie before watching it. That includes who's going to be in it, and even who's on the poster. So as a result, my first viewing for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness was really enjoyable, and having rewatched it multiple times since, my enjoyment has actually been strengthened. It's also worth mentioning that we got the exact amount of multiverse I was expecting from this film. I don't think it had been announced by the time this movie was released, but as someone who reads Marvel Comics, it was obvious that the MCU was leading up to Secret Wars, which is a multiverse-heavy idea. So I was actually concerned there would be too much multiverse in Doctor Strange, because that would diminish the impact of Avengers Secret Wars. But if people were unaware of Secret Wars and had seen the Doctor Strange trailers, you can see why they might have expected more multiverse stuff. So that's one reason why scores might not have been high as they could have been. The other main reason I read from reviews was because they treated Wanda as if she was some kind of big reveal that she was the villain. Even if you didn't watch the trailers, you'd figure that out before the film even tells you. Apparently there was a deleted scene at the beginning of the movie where Mordo was chasing Wanda to remove her magic, only to be outpowered by the Scarlet Witch, ending his life. I really wish they kept that scene in. Not only would it have tied off the loose end left in the post-credit scene of the first Doctor Strange movie, but also shown us straight away that Wanda was going to be the villain. Despite these critiques, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness made almost $1 billion at the worldwide box office, which you could say is because it was coming off the back of Spider-Man No Way Home, but that would have really only helped the opening weekend. The rest of the dollary-doos is usually based on positive word of mouth. I think one of the reasons for this idea that the MCU died after Avengers Endgame is because the Infinity Saga felt like the movies were trying to target the most amount of people possible. Since then, we've had things which are more stylistic, tonally darker, or tonally lighter. Basically, movies and shows that have a more targeted audience. The Ms. Marvel series is an example of that. Ms. Marvel is a coming-of-age show, and the high school genre with a bit of romance sprinkled in doesn't always have the same crossover with people who enjoy heavy action stuff. Reading the reviews, this was almost exactly what people are saying, that it's made for kids. But guess what? It kind of was. The way I can definitively prove this is that they literally released each episode on the same day as the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. There's obviously a significant crossover of Star Wars and Marvel fans, but I think Marvel just wanted the people their show was targeted to watch it, rather than the entire fandom to prevent review bombing. Although it still did get review bombed before it was released. Assuming everything should be made for you is wild. But again, I do understand why people may have this perception, given that was the case for the first 3 phases of the MCU. Horror movies scare me, so I don't really watch them. If I watch a horror film and get frightened, I don't go, 1 out of 10, I was scared. I acknowledge that it wasn't for me. So if you actually look at the reviews that talk about the story and characters itself, people seem to think that it was a good, solid show. Overall ratings would even back this up, with 98% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, 80% from audiences, and 6.2 on IMDb. And the IMDb rating is hard to comment on its validity, because the series faced significant review bombing before the show was even released. Review bombing is something I'll talk about more very shortly, but to reiterate what I said before, I think Ms. Marvel was the turning point for people realizing that the MCU was trying to broaden its audience. After the financial and critical success of Thor Ragnarok, taking the character in a more light-hearted direction, it made sense for Thor Love and Thunder to bring Taika Waititi back to once again write and direct. However, the problems expressed in the reviews and by both Chris Hemsworth and Taika Waititi's admission is that the movie went too light-hearted, becoming almost goofy. When I spoke about the first season of Loki, I mentioned my concern about making a show centered around a character who had only received limited screen time. Sometimes, the amount a character appears on screen is the exact right amount and the reason why they resonate with audiences. It's the same situation for comedy. I think when people said they enjoyed the comedy of Thor Ragnarok, it was interpreted as, give us more comedy. And in this scenario, Rotten Tomatoes reviews of 63% from critics, 76% from audiences, and 6.2 on IMDb will suggest they may have gone overboard with the comedy, and that their third installment had the right balance of humour. Despite this, the box office was still a solid $760 million, but the underwhelming reviews could also be because they missed an opportunity to call the fourth Thor film, Thor. That was my main disappointment. I Am Groot are the 3 words spoken by Groot, and the 3 words that make up the title of 10 shorts over 2 seasons featuring pre-Guardians of the Galaxy Volleyball 2, Groot. If this is the thing that turned you off the MCU, that would be pretty wild, but also fascinating if you got offended by 10 5-minute, completely harmless shorts. It doesn't affect the larger narrative of the MCU, it's not essential viewing to understand anything else, and it doesn't even tell us anything we don't already know from the second Guardians of the Galaxy movie. And they wouldn't have spent that much money on it either, so it's not like it was taking finances away from other projects. I saw multiple reviews of people saying that I Am Groot is just a cash grab to sell more toys. Like, yeah, it probably was. What's wrong with that? If Marvel has to make harmless shorts like this to make a ton of money on toys to then spend on other, bigger projects, I'm very okay with that. I read a lot of reviews like this. Most people understood the target audience, but there were also a decent amount getting so offended by it being targeted to a younger demographic. Like I mentioned with Ms. Marvel, I think a lot of people got the assumption that pre-Endgame MCU was trying to target the most amount of people possible, so when Phase 4 and beyond decided to make more content for specific groups of people, it caused outrage. But by this point in the multiverse saga, it should be clear that not every movie and show is for you. People's negative opinions on this one kind of baffled me. But anyway, what were those actual scores? 89% from critics, 76% from audiences, and 6.7 on IMDb. I don't recall there being any online discussion about She-Hulk Attorney at Law from memory. Everyone seems super polite and respectful with their opinion. Well, except for the review bombing before it was released, the blatant sexism from viewers, the harassment to the people involved in making it, being defensive against the truth, and getting offended by a twerk. If you don't like this show, that's totally fine, but it's an undeniable fact that She-Hulk Attorney at Law was review bombed before it was released. So the question is, why? And the answer is, we know why. Because sexism exists. Well, that was an easy question to answer. There's this term that gets thrown around a bit. You may have heard of it. It's called woke. There's a few definitions for this word, one being the past tense of wake, the other being alert to and concerned about social injustice and discrimination. So it's kind of weird that the term woke gets thrown around as a negative when it literally means not being a bigot. Representation is important because it inspires people. Seeing someone who physically looks like you adds the extra layer of emotional connection. The movie Coda is about a family who is deaf with a daughter who can hear. The theme of the movie has been told a million times before, but the film feels completely original because it's representing characters rarely put to screen. In a behind-the-scenes interview for the movie Coco, the people with a Mexican heritage who worked on the Pixar film spoke about growing up feeling like there was something wrong with them because they never saw themselves in movies or on TV. And because of this, they would instinctively draw characters with blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. There are more people that exist in the world than just straight white men. In the Infinity Saga of the MCU, the first 17 movies were led by straight white male characters. We then got Black Panther, then 4 movies later, Captain Marvel. And guess what happened with the Captain Marvel reviews? They got review bombed before it was even released. Rotten Tomatoes had to literally change their site, so you couldn't review movies until after they were released because of this review bombing from Captain Marvel. This doesn't happen to other movies and shows. It's a pattern, and the common element is a female lead. People will even go out of their way to make any of these people involved look worse. I want to see Brie Larson play Captain Marvel forever, but if she decides to leave, I would totally understand because of the amount of unwarranted hate she gets. The same with She-Hulk's Tatiana Maslany, who had her scenes cut from Deadpool and Wolverine, and when asked about it on the Comedy Bang Bang podcast, this is what she said.
I was in Deadpool Wolverine.
Okay.
I had 2 scenes in it.
No.
And then Ryan Reynolds fired me because he said, I don't like these scenes. And now I'm suing Disney.
What?
And these are the facts
Okay,
of
so
what is going on.
have you filed the lawsuit yet? Or?
Yes.
You okay?
And I'm also always talking about how much I hate Wolverine and Deadpool. I also wish I would just sit down and stop pushing my feminist agenda and just realize that the movie made a lot of money and She-Hulk made $3. That's why they got rid of me, because I had this woke agenda and I really wanted to bring it into the movie.
I remember you telling me that you kind of ad-libbed a bunch of stuff about the
my
Wolf
feminist manifesto.
Yeah, exactly.
She's clearly joking, but of course people took that out of context or posted her quote in written form, removing the sarcasm to make it look like she was ungrateful. Even Anthony Mackie got heat in an interview for saying that Captain America isn't a great name for the character because the title represents more than America, despite Chris Evans literally saying the exact same thing over a decade ago. If you're someone who calls something woke, what do you mean by that? If a movie or show has a female lead and you complain about it being woke, what's your problem with having female leads? If a character has a shade of skin that's anything other than white and you complain about it being woke, what's your problem with having diverse skin colours? If someone is gay or trans and you complain about it being woke, what's your problem with the LGBTQ+ community? Not only do all these people exist, but they haven't gotten rid of straight white male characters either. There's still plenty of those movies and shows. Post-Endgame has just decided to acknowledge the fact that society doesn't only have one look. They're not forcing diversity down your throat. The only reason why you might feel this way is because you're not used to seeing different groups of people represented on screen. And for those who say the She-Hulk show hates men, what part is inaccurate? Is it the sexist remarks, the online harassment, the fact that men won't listen to women? If you're offended by the show acknowledging the truth, you're the problem. Listen to women, listen to people who are gay or trans or a different skin color to you to understand why they are saying the things they are saying so you can empathize with them. These groups of people have been subjected to trolls their whole life. It's not enough to say that you're not sexist or racist or homophobic or transphobic. You need to actually be listening to these groups of people so you can appreciate why they're saying the things they're saying and use this information to call out bigots to stop the cycle. You don't want your friend to say something misogynistic knowing you could have prevented that. Going back to the MCU movies and shows, there are also people who genuinely don't like the quality of some of these projects that just happen to heavily feature diversity. However, they feel like they can't express that opinion without feeling grouped into the same category as those who cry woke. This can actually be detrimental to the quality of content, because if the only people critiquing something are saying it's bad because there's a girl in it, Marvel isn't gonna listen. If you're someone who has genuine critique about a movie or show, stop using the excuse of it being woke and start actually providing constructive criticism, because that way, not only will Marvel listen, but it will make others feel comfortable expressing their opinion too. So again, if you don't like She-Hulk Attorney at Law, that's totally fine. I've read some genuine criticism, and I understand how the final episode is a very stylistic choice that's not for everyone. But if the reason why you don't like something is because of the previously mentioned reasons, please, I urge you to look outside. Look at a scene from a movie that takes place in Manhattan and see all the different types of people that exist. This show is just acknowledging one of those groups. Anyway, this may come as a massive surprise to you, but She-Hulk Attorney at Law did not get great reviews from audiences, with 5.2 on IMDb and 32% on Rotten Tomatoes, but critics were more generous, scoring at 79%. So they were obviously paid. Werewolf by Night was Marvel Studios' first special presentation, showing the company once again trying something really unique to their brand. Not only was the special in black and white, but it was rated for a mature audience. So I imagine anyone under the age of 15 must have been absolutely outraged that they made something not targeted towards them. Michael Giacchino was the director behind this project, who's more known for composing scores, most notably The Incredibles, Up, Inside Out, Doctor Strange, and The Batman. His only prior directing credits were a couple of short films, so it was his connection with Marvel Studios that would have gotten him the gig. And based on the reviews, more people should give Mike the opportunity to direct, because a 90% critic score, 88% from audiences, and 7.1 on IMDb is pretty impressive for something so stylistic. Werewolf by Night is also another example of not having to have prior MCU knowledge. It's a completely contained story that has no implication on the larger narrative, which is something appreciated in the reviews. Black Panther Wakanda Forever had the impossible task of trying to make a Black Panther movie after the death of Chadwick Boseman. The decision was made to not recast T'Challa, a decision which I understand. Black Panther was really the first mainstream superhero movie to have a lead character who was black. Yes, Blade was a movie released 20 years prior, but that trilogy was for a mature audience. Black Panther is something younglings could watch too. Because of how notable the role became, the decision to recast was much more difficult than other examples of characters being posthumously replaced. Whatever decision Marvel Studios was going to make, there would be questions raised regardless. According to director Ryan Coogler, the Chadwick Boseman script was going to have a lot of similar elements that was seen in the final movie. But without T'Challa being Black Panther, it meant they needed to add the storyline which incorporated Shuri becoming that character, because you can't have a movie called Black Panther without Black Panther. And based on the reviews I read, I think that's where the critique came in. If T'Challa was still in the movie, it would have drastically reduced the runtime and ultimately sped the story up. But despite these critiques, Rotten Tomatoes still scored at 84 from critics, 94 from audiences, while over on IMDb, it sits at 6.6. And on top of that, it was another box office success, making $860 million. Regardless of whether you enjoyed Black Panther Wakanda Forever or not, I think most people were understanding of the difficulties to make it due to the behind the scenes situation.
Christmas time is here.
There's not really a lot I need to say about the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday special. I think it fits into a similar category as I Am Groot. Ironically, another Guardians of the Galaxy adjacent project. The special is just pure, light-hearted, enjoy it for what it is, entertainment. Director James Gunn even said it was nice to make in between filming Guardians of the Galaxy Volleyball 3, with that being such a heavy film emotionally. So to the reviews, 94% from critics, 81% from audiences on Rotten Tomatoes, and 6.9 on IMDb. It was also the most streamed film in the week it was released, and remained in the top 5 for a month. It's an easy thing to put on during the holiday season for light-hearted family entertainment. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania was the movie that saw the beginning of the drop-off for people going to see Marvel films in the cinema. While still being profitable, it only made $476 million at the box office, making it the 4th lowest grossing MCU movie if you don't include the COVID-affected films. The underwhelming box office would partly be due to the 46% critic score, 81% audience, and 6.0 on IMDb, but also with the MCU movies and shows being hit or miss review-wise over the last year, I think Quantumania marked the beginning of people being more selective of the Marvel films they see in cinema. While Jonathan Majors was found guilty of reckless assault in the third degree and harassment, meaning he would no longer be playing Kang in the already announced Avengers Kang Dynasty film, I don't think this conviction was the only reason Marvel decided to scrap that villain as the main antagonist for the multiverse conclusion. As Kang the Conqueror, one of the most dangerous Kangs, was defeated pretty easily by Ant-Man and Wasp, it would have been odd to have the character go up against dozens of even more powerful Avengers. I also wouldn't actually be surprised if the idea for Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania came about during COVID. I'm purely speculating here, but for a movie that was written and filmed during this time, there may have been discussion to come up with an idea that could be filmed entirely on a soundstage to limit the amount of people required on set and reduce the risk of getting sick during production. Because there's like one scene that doesn't look like it was filmed on a green screen. Despite the lack of volleyball in Guardians of the Galaxy Volleyball 3, the movie received the highest IMDb score since Spider-Man No Way Home, that being 7.9. It also did very well on Rotten Tomatoes, with 82% from critics and 94% from audiences. But despite the positive reviews of the previous 2 movies and the special, it actually made less at the box office than the sequel. Having said that, it still earned $845 million globally. The main factor for not crossing the billion comes down to the opening weekend. It did okay in the opening weekend, making $118 million, but the second movie made $146. The third movie eventually picked up because of positive word of mouth, but the drop from the sequel is almost certainly due to the reception of the previous movies and shows within the MCU. As I mentioned with Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, the idea that MCU movies were must-watch and must-watch opening weekend was a concept that was fading, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volleyball 3 was at the receiving end of that, despite being reviewed positively. Ever since Captain America the Winter Soldier, the MCU has tried a number of times to replicate that magic. The most obvious attempt at this is Secret Invasion, but according to the reviews of 53% critics, 43% audiences, and 5.9 on IMDb, they weren't quite able to. I have a series that talks about the differences between the comics to how a character is represented on screen, and if you've seen any of those videos, you'd know that every character has significant differences from page to screen, and I think it almost always works. The idea that they should have just stuck to the source material is an odd argument, because that seems to only be said for one element of a character or story, when there are loads of differences that you don't even notice because they work well. Captain America Civil War is significantly different and a scaled back version of the comic event that it's based on, yet the changes made worked for the universe Marvel Studios had created. Scaling Secret Invasion right back from what it is in the comics could have also worked. The story they were trying to tell didn't require the Avengers, unlike the comics. But unfortunately, because the reviews were underwhelming, one of the main criticisms people made was to stick to the source material. Ultimately, a movie or show works because of how it's executed. The better it is, the less people care about changes from page to screen. But if the reviews are negative, the blame always starts with changing the source material. Up until this point, the only two characters in the MCU who have had a full character arc concluded are Tony Stark and Steve Rogers. But most people agree that Loki now joins that list after his second TV season. There's something very satisfying with definitively ending the journey for a character. The third Guardians of the Galaxy kind of did it, but you feel like they could easily jump into another story with those characters without really missing a beat. Having said all of that, Loki is definitely returning for Avengers Doomsday and or Secret Wars. Doctor Doom or someone is breaking that tree. One of the things about the types of shows Marvel is producing is that they fit more into the category of miniseries, telling a larger narrative over a number of episodes. For this reason, I don't really like judging episodes individually. I prefer looking at it as a narrative overall. You tend to find those slower, more character developing or story building episodes to be reviewed lower because they may not feel important or exciting at the time, but once you've seen the entire series, if you retrospectively look back, you'll come to really appreciate those moments. So as for those reviews, Loki Season 2 is the first MCU movie or show where both audiences and critics agreed on the score, that being 82%. Over on IMDb, the season had an average episode rating of 8.4, making it the highest rated piece of MCU content post-Avengers Endgame. The lack of strong female lead characters has meant it's difficult to write for them. The reason is because there are so few examples of them being given an opportunity compared to men in the history of cinema. I guarantee most people can't even name 5 strong female leads off the top of their head. And I'm not just talking about physically strong. There was a whole era where if the lead was a female, her whole personality would be a damsel in distress. A big, strong, handsome man, who up until this point had had 30 seconds of screen time, will swoop in at the end to save the day, then kiss his teenage love. So once movie studios finally started giving genuine opportunity for there to be a female lead character, there was almost an overcorrection, but with good intention. Instead of making the character helpless, they made them refuse to ask for help at all. Due to a lack of strong female characters to be inspired by, it's understandable that it might be a challenge to write for them, knowing every detail of their personality will be judged, trying to find a reason to say it's poorly written. You can see why writers are afraid to give strong female characters deep flaws. It's almost like representation is important, because in this case, by finding out why some female characters aren't resonating with audiences, it provides an opportunity to learn and improve. Anyway, the reviews for the Marvels were 62% critics, 80% audiences, and 5.5 on IMDb. The box office wasn't too great either, only making $208 million on a budget close to double that, going on to be the lowest grossing MCU movie of all time. But for those saying go woke, go broke, the highest grossing movie released the same year as the Marvels was the Barbie movie. It's almost like that saying is just a meaningless rhyme, because also released in 2023 was Expendables, a movie that made $50 million on a budget twice that. What if there was a second and third season of Marvel's What If? Unfortunately, there was a gradual regression of each season in terms of reviews, with Season 2 scoring 87 from critics, 62 from audiences, and averaging 7.3 per episode on IMDb, while the third and final season was 79% critics, 33% audiences, and 6.1 on IMDb. I think part of the reason for this is due to the characters involved. The first season saw characters we knew and had seen many times, so seeing them in a slightly different light is interesting. However, for the later seasons, reviews were literally saying, "Who cares?" Which I interpret as, we barely know who these characters are in the main universe, so why should we care what's happening with a parallel one? So that ultimately asks the question, is the MCU too big? Are there too many characters? Should we be giving characters more than one arc, rather than saying one and done? To answer that last question, I think yes and no. I still want to see contained stories like Werewolf by Night or Moon Knight, but I also think that focusing on characters that have already been introduced should be a strong focus. Around the time we got the first live-action X-Men and Spider-Man movies, the Marvel Comics introduced a new universe referred to as the Ultimate Universe. One of the reasons for this was to introduce new readers to their characters without overloading them with an expansive world. Instead of thousands of characters, they just focused on hundreds, which is more manageable than it sounds. This could be a possible direction the MCU could go in after Avengers Secret Wars. If the movie follows a similar path to the 2015 Secret Wars comic run, it's safe to assume that the movie will be a soft reboot, resetting the universe with characters from across the multiverse. The next phase could then focus on different pockets of the universe. What I mean by this is that they don't connect everything together. Have maybe 3 sub-banners under the Marvel Studios banner, targeting different audiences, like Marvel Knights for older audiences, featuring characters like Daredevil, Shang-Chi, Xiling, Elsa Bloodstone, Moon Knight, Blade, the Black Knight, etc. Then have something for a more youthful audience, like Young Avengers/Champions, and finally have movies and shows for the general audience that features the Avengers characters. But all this still set within the same universe, just without crossing over or having significant referencing. And it could also be more beneficial to do more team-up stuff, so you could tell more characters' stories instead of having to wait for their solo stuff. That's just my idea. I think people currently feel like they need to watch everything to stay up to date in an interconnected universe, even when something's not targeted to them. So by eliminating that need to watch everything, you reduce the hate and pressure to keep up with the overwhelming amount of content. Anyway, to finish off What If, I've also seen people make the comment that Marvel is forcing Captain Carter onto us. The only thing she's been in outside of What If is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness for like 5 minutes. And What If is her show. Yes, it's an anthology series, but there's also a larger narrative that centers around Peggy. And again, she's only in like half a dozen of the 30 or so episodes. No one watched the Guardians of the Galaxy sequels and went, why does Groot keep showing up? They're forcing Groot onto us. Echo is a sound or sounds caused by the reflection of sound waves from a surface back to the listener. It's also a mini-series produced by Marvel Studios and the first under the Marvel Spotlight banner. According to executive producer Brad Winderbaum, the idea for Marvel Spotlight was to bring more grounded, character-driven stories to the screen. You don't need to read Avengers or Fantastic Four stories to enjoy Ghost Rider Spotlight comic, in the same way you don't need to have seen other Marvel movies or shows to understand May's story. When I initially read this, I thought it was a bit of an oversimplification, thinking you need to have at least watched the series to understand Kingpin's story for the future of his character. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised the only thing Echo told us about Kingpin that will have ramifications on the larger MCU is that he's still alive. So that could easily be once again touched upon in Daredevil Born Again. I mean, there's plenty of questions surrounding that character. Anyway, going back to Marvel Spotlight, the concept was a smart decision. Considering the amount of content produced, it's nice to know you don't have to do any homework to understand what's going on. And if you're a younger audience, missing out on the show because of the mature themes isn't going to cause you to be lost in upcoming movies and shows within the universe. The Marvel Spotlight name could also indicate it putting a spotlight on creative people who haven't been well represented. In this case, we not only have an actor who is deaf, but also an amputee and Native American. When you don't represent groups of people on screen, the next generation doesn't really have anything to inspire towards, because they're thinking, people who look like me aren't being put in movies and shows, so I guess I can't be an actor. It's kind of like women's sports. When people complain about the quality, they're not really taking into account the fact that women's sports are only really getting the spotlight now. Girls who played sport when they were young stopped when they became teenagers because there was no one to look up to and no profession to aspire towards. Now, thanks to more funding and easy to access telecasts, these girls now know they can make a career out of it, so they're staying in the sport, developing their skills, and being more advanced when they enter the system. As someone who has watched women's sports for a number of years now, I've seen the evidence in progression. But to those who just watch a clip with poor skill and interpret that as 100% of the quality, you need to understand that it still might take another 5 or 6 years to iron out the bumps, because it won't be until the next generation, who've grown up their whole life with role models to look up to, funded development and legitimate pathways to make a career out of. So by Marvel putting a spotlight on different groups of people, it will hopefully inspire their next generation to take a creative path. As for the reviews, critics gave Echo 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, audiences scored at 60, and IMDb said 6 out of 10. Marvel Studios also made the decision to release all 5 episodes of Echo on the same day, which I think was the correct decision for a show like this, particularly as there was not really any spoiler-heavy moments, which would force people to stay offline until they'd seen the entire series. Finally, something not woke, said people who complain about wokeness when Deadpool and Wolverine was released. I mean, by definition, it still is. There are plenty of woke elements to it, but that's not what I'm going to talk about for this movie. Fanservice is more risky than whatever the opposite of fanservice is. Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker is a movie that tried to please all the people that didn't like The Last Jedi, but as a result, ended up being the second lowest rated Star Wars movie on IMDb, only ahead of the animated Clone Wars film. The Rise of Skywalker felt like it was trying to undo everything from The Last Jedi and include as many references to the previous movies as possible. There's nothing wrong with making a fanservice movie, filling scenes with Easter eggs. That can be fun and enjoyable, but that's not the reason people like those films. Avengers Endgame is a perfect example. At the end of the day, if the story isn't good, those nods and winks feel tacky and cringy. So when Deadpool added Wolverine, skepticism emerged due to having perfectly wrapped up Logan's story. Was this character just included to sell more tickets? Probably. I mean, it did make $1.3 billion, but becoming the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time was because they managed to make a compelling story around those fan service moments, and the reviews of 78% critics, 94% audience score, and 7.6 on IMDb would suggest that they got that right. And how dare Deadpool do a dance that involves shaking his ass? It's an embarrassment to the MCU. I wish Agatha All Along was released all at once, because it's like people forgot it was a miniseries. The reviews from the first couple of episodes were either, it's fine, or it's forgettable. So I'm worried those people left and missed out on a show that went from 6.7 after the first week to 7.2 overall. And that's not even factoring in the review bombing before the show even started, which I don't even need to explain why. Although, to be fair, the review bombing for Agatha All Along might not have been sexist. It could have also been homophobic or racist. So because Agatha All Along didn't get review bombed on Rotten Tomatoes, it got 84 and 83%. And people noticed this, so by the 7th episode, there was a 35% increase in viewers since the premiere, and the 8th episode had 10% more than that on just the first day. So what did we learn from this? Miniseries are one narrative told over multiple episodes, and sometimes it takes a couple of episodes to get into. I mean, most shows take a couple of episodes to get into. Can you imagine if everyone gave up after the first 2 episodes of The US Office?
No! God!
For people who just want Avengers and Iron Man movies, Your Friendly Neighbourhood Spider-Man is the perfect example of what might happen if those are the only films we get. Don't get me wrong, this series is reviewed very well, and I enjoyed it very much, but can we move on from teenage Peter Parker? For those who don't read the comics, you may assume the character is a teenager, but the Prime Universe character has appeared in literally thousands of comics, and he graduated high school in his 28th issue. He then graduated uni in Amazing Spider-Man issue 185. He spent 90% of his time in the comics as an adult, yet every single on-screen adaptation is either from a high school or college years Peter Parker. And that's the same for Your Friendly Neighbourhood Spider-Man. I feel like I've already seen this story 100 times before, and I understand they're trying to bring in a new audience for this character every few years, but Your Friendly Neighbourhood Spider-Man doesn't really feel like it's for the next generation. It felt like it was for people who grew up with Tom Holland's Spider-Man or the Into the Spider-Verse movies who already know this character. Sony has the live-action rights to Spider-Man, and 2 of their live-action Peter Parkers are old enough to tell a story from that stage of life. That's what I want to see. You can have multiple Spider-Man movies and shows running at the same time, like Batman. I'm just kidding, give us Kraven the Madam Morbius! Also, people once again hated on Your Friendly Neighbourhood Spider-Man before it was released because there were characters with different skin colours and genders to what they originally were in the comics. You know, there are an infinite amount of universes within the Marvel Comics where there is every variation of every character, so if your defense is that it's not comic accurate, you're actually wrong. If I haven't made this clear already, stop saying woke as a negative. If you have a problem with seeing characters that aren't straight white men, then you're just racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, and or any other type of bigot, and I hope you step on Lego. By the time Captain America Brave New World was released, it hadn't even been 6 years since Avengers Endgame had ended, and the MCU had added 13 movies, 120 episodes of TV, and 2 specials. That's an average of 1 piece of content every 16 days. This is where I can understand the argument of the MCU died after Endgame. There's no time to build up hyper anticipation because one thing will end and the next thing will be released almost immediately after, so you don't have time to reflect and appreciate on what just came. Part of the magic is lost when there's no buzz surrounding the release. Something similar has happened with Star Wars. You used to have to wait an entire generation for the next 3 movies. Now you don't even have to wait a whole calendar year. So if we add Captain America Brave New World's Rotten Tomatoes scores of 49% from critics, 79% from audiences, and 6.1 on IMDb to the graph of every movie and show post-Avengers Endgame, we can see that we got 3 movies and shows with a score below 6, 12 movies and shows between 6 and 6.9, and 16 movies and shows rated 7 or above. And if you compare that with Rotten Tomatoes, critics had 4 rotten, 4 fresh, and 23 certified fresh, and audiences gave 3 rotten, 3 fresh, and 25 certified fresh. Looking at this on a line graph, the general consensus would tell you that they had a small hiccup of movies and shows that were all released around the same time, starting in 2022. But obviously, because these movies and shows take a couple of years to make, learning from this criticism won't really show any effect until about now. So if Marvel Studios has been listening to the scores and looking at the box office, which they absolutely would have, I think Thunderbolts Asterix and Fantastic Four First Step will, dare I say, be their first step in the direction back to form. As for average ratings, pre-Endgame was 85% critics, 82% audiences, and 7.4 on IMDb, while post-Endgame, average scores were 80% critics, 79% audiences, and 6.9 on IMDb. Here's one more graph for you depicting the entire MCU box office. So you can see it gradually built up, remained steady for a while, then COVID provided a hiccup before inconsistent reviews led to up and down box office results. Speaking of COVID, most of these negatively reviewed movies and shows were made during that time. Not saying that's an excuse, but I feel like it would have had at least a little bit of impact on the quality. For example, making it difficult to do reshoots or having to communicate online as opposed to doing it in a collaborative space that they may be used to. I don't know, all I'm saying is that it could have been a factor. I think it's easy for people to be critical of the MCU when there are a few negatively reviewed projects in a row, but if you actually look back on everything that's been released, not just post-Endgame, but before then too, it's a genuine accomplishment to have made this much financial and critical success. Sustained success doesn't happen in any facet of life, not in sport, not in business, not in anyone's life. I'm confident that Marvel will learn from their hiccups and show just why they're the most successful cinematic franchise of all time. I do believe that Kevin Feige and his team are the right people to continue making movies and shows within the MCU for many years to come. So to answer the question I posed at the beginning of the video, did the MCU die after Avengers Endgame? I don't know, movies and shows are subjective. If you still like it, great. If not, you don't have to watch it. No one's forcing you to see these movies and shows. I'm obviously kidding. Movies and shows are objective, and your opinion is correct. But in all seriousness, I've given you the numbers to say whether or not the general audience still enjoys the MCU, and I think they do. And they're still making these movies and shows, so it's not actually over. But if you want to get really technical, I guess all these movies and shows did come out after Avengers Endgame. So obviously, some of you meant the MCU didn't immediately die after Endgame. You meant that it died 15 movies and shows later, which is still after Endgame. You got me. Well played. My conclusion as to why I think we hear this comment of the MCU died after Avengers Endgame comes down to one of 3 things. 1, you're just someone who genuinely doesn't like a lot of movies and shows that have come out since, and that's totally fine. 2, you're someone who cries woke, and that's not totally fine. Or 3, you're someone who enjoys most of these projects, but are overwhelmed by the amount of content, which has led you to feel like the magic of the franchise has died because of the oversaturation. But also, the oversaturation may have nothing to do with the magic being gone. We all grow up and our interests change. And 2, people talk about post-Endgame as if they weren't critical of films before that movie. Remember when people hated on Iron Man 2 and Thor: The Dark World? The MCU started 17 years ago. People have literally been born and graduated high school between Iron Man and now. So maybe the MCU is just no longer for you. Marvel may have determined that the Infinity Saga was for one generation and the Multiverse Saga is for the next. The Star Wars prequels are movies that are poorly reviewed by those who grew up with the original trilogy, but those who grew up with the prequels tend to enjoy them more and have the same reaction to the sequel trilogy. In 10 years' time, there will be people who grew up with The Force Awakens, Last Jedi, and Rise of Skywalker having nostalgia towards those films. I feel like this is the same case for the MCU. As for my opinion, I genuinely love the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I still get excited every time I see a new movie or show. Part of that is by avoiding knowing anything about the movie or show before watching it, so I go in completely fresh. I know people will say this will devalue everything I just said, but I don't actually dislike anything produced by Marvel Studios. except for one episode of one of their shows. And I will never reveal what that is because I don't like hating on things. That's not to say I think everything is perfect, but at worst, I watch one of their movies or shows and go, yeah, I enjoyed it. And I'm excited to see how Marvel Studios will learn from the feedback. You learn more from failing than you do from success. It allows the opportunity to see what went wrong to try and prevent it from happening again. I've always been a Marvel fan. I've read an insane amount of Marvel comics, I've seen every Marvel movie multiple times, and I just enjoy them. I think the reason for me making this video in the first place is because of those people who go out of their way to hate on something they don't actually care about. If all you do is hate on Marvel movies and shows, you're not really a fan. Because people make these movies and shows and they have feelings and emotions. So if you don't take that into account, then you can't care about this franchise because you don't even care about the people who make it. Despite what you may think, I guarantee Kevin Feige has never tried to make a bad movie or show. You can clearly see he's passionate about these characters and wants them to succeed. If you believe there's a drop in quality, I think that all comes down to trying to oversee too many pieces of content at once. Overseeing 2 or 3 movies a year is one thing, but adding 3 or 4 shows to that, and it adds a whole new challenge. To anyone who thinks Kevin Feige should be fired because of the oversaturation, the amount of movies and shows being put out is not his decision, it's Disney's. They tell him how many to make, and he determines what those projects are. I don't think there are some people who really understand how rare a Kevin Feige type producer is. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have gone Guardians of the Galaxy or any of the more risky projects. If someone else takes over, we could very well just be alternating between an Avengers movie and an Iron Man film, because those are the biggest moneymakers. You may enjoy the sound of that, but you'll get bored of it pretty quickly. I think the idea that the MCU has died is a massive overstatement. I'm not denying there has been negatively reviewed projects, but there has also been a significant amount of quality entertainment and some very healthy box office and streaming numbers. Marvel has actually given life to different groups of people, with now having mainstream characters and behind the scenes creatives that look like them to inspire their future. Also, I loved She-Hulk Attorney at Law, especially the last episode. I know there are people who will claim this comment lost all credibility for the video, but I don't care. It was a fun, enjoyable watch, and I really hope we see this character again. Anyway, what are your thoughts? Do you think the idea that the MCU died after Avengers Endgame is an over-exaggeration? Let me know in the comments. But thanks for watching. Don't forget to absolutely obliterate those like, subscribe, and share buttons. I'm just kidding. Only do it with enough force that it registers. I don't want any of you breaking whatever device you're watching this on.